We are often told that history is written by the winners, but in reality, history is usually written by the people who want to tell the best story. From your first-grade classroom to the local cinema, the facts we've inherited are often just polished, simplified versions of a much messier truth. We cling to these myths because they provide us with clear heroes and aha moments, but the real world doesn't work in movie clips. Today, we are opening the vault and looking at 10 massive historical truths that are actually pure fiction, proving that sometimes the easiest version to remember is the hardest one to justify. Number 1. The gravity of the situation. Newton's apple. The image is etched into the collective human consciousness. Sir Isaac Newton, sitting in a tranquil orchard in 1666, lost in thought until a rogue apple strikes him square on the head. In that moment of impact, the laws of the universe supposedly clicked into place. It's a perfect eureka moment, clean, sudden, and deeply cinematic. However, the bonk never happened. Newton himself, in his later years, told the story to his biographers, but he never mentioned being struck. He simply looked out of his window at Woolsthorpe Manor and observed an apple falling to the ground. The real story isn't a 5-second miracle, it's a decades-long grind. Newton didn't discover gravity because of a piece of fruit. He spent years isolated from the world during the Great Plague, performing grueling mathematical calculations that would eventually become the Principia Mathematica. We prefer the apple to the head version because it makes genius look like a stroke of luck. If genius is just a random event, we don't have to feel bad about not being geniuses. But if genius is actually 20 years of sitting in a dark room doing calculus until your eyes bleed, that's a much more uncomfortable truth to face. Number 2. The scripted detective. Sherlock's famous line. If you ask anyone to quote Sherlock Holmes, they will immediately say, "Elementary, my dear Watson." It is the ultimate catchphrase, the verbal shorthand for a genius who's bored by the obvious. It's appeared in thousands of parodies, sketches, and movies. But if you open any of the 56 short stories or 4 novels written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, you will find a startling void. Sherlock Holmes never said it. He says elementary plenty of times. He calls his companion "my dear Watson" constantly. But those 2 pieces of dialogue were never joined in the original text. The line was actually stitched together by stage actor William Gillette in the late 1890s and later solidified by the 1939 film The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It is a classic example of the Mandela effect, a collective false memory created by pop culture's need for a hook. We've essentially rewritten the literature in our heads because the fake version is punchier than the real one. Number 4. The flat earth fallacy. We love to look back at the Middle Ages and laugh at how stupid people were. We've been taught that before Columbus, everyone lived in fear that ships would sail off the edge of a flat earth into a void of sea monsters. This narrative paints the medieval era as a dark age of ignorance, with Columbus as the lone, enlightened visionary. This is a total fabrication. Educated people in the Middle Ages, monks, sailors, and scholars, knew the earth was a sphere. They had inherited the works of Aristotle and Eratosthenes, who had calculated the earth's circumference with 99% accuracy over 1,000 years earlier. The conflict between Columbus and the Spanish court wasn't about the shape of the world, it was about the size. Columbus's math was actually terrible. He thought the world was much smaller than it was. The scholars of the time told him he'd starve to death before reaching Asia because the ocean was too big. They were right. He only survived because he accidentally bumped into a continent he didn't know existed. The flat earth myth was actually invented in the 1800s by writers like Washington Irving to make the age of reason look better by making the past look worse. Number 4. The Technicolor Ancients. When we walk through the halls of the Louvre or the British Museum, we see a sea of pristine white marble.
we've come to associate ancient Greece and Rome with a minimalistic, refined aesthetic. This white marble look became the gold standard for Western beauty and architecture. But to an ancient Greek, our modern museums would look half-finished and depressing. In reality, those statues were gaudily, brilliantly painted. Recent UV light tests have revealed microscopic traces of pigment on white statues. They wore bright blue robes, had tanned skin tones, and even wore painted-on makeup and eyelashes. Their temples, including the Parthenon, were decorated in loud reds and golds. Over thousands of years, the paint weathered away, leaving the bare stone. When Renaissance artists dug them up, they assumed the white was the original intent. We've spent 500 years building a classy civilization based on a massive archaeological misunderstanding. The ancients weren't minimalist, they were maximalist.
Number 5. The Great Wall from Space. It's the ultimate trivia question. What is the only man-made structure visible from space? For decades, the answer has been the Great Wall of China. It's a point of pride for humanity, a structure so massive it can be seen from the moon. Except it's physically impossible. The Great Wall is very long, but it is also very narrow, roughly 20 to 30 feet wide. It is also made of stone that is almost exactly the same color as the surrounding terrain. Astronauts from the Apollo missions and the International Space Station have confirmed that you cannot see the wall with the naked eye from orbit, and you definitely can't see it from the moon. You can see city lights at night and sometimes major highways if the contrast is right, but the Great Wall remains invisible. This myth actually started in the 1930s, 30 years before we even put a satellite into space. It was a poetic exaggeration that became a fact through sheer repetition. If you want to see the wall from space, you need a high-powered telescope, not a window seat on a rocket. Number 6. The unsinkable marketing gimmick. The tragedy of the Titanic is often framed as a cosmic punishment for human arrogance. The story goes that the White Star Line boasted that the ship was unsinkable, only for God or nature to prove them wrong on the very first trip. It's a perfect moral lesson. But if you look at the actual advertising brochures from 1912, the word unsinkable is almost entirely absent. The company actually described the ship as practically unsinkable, which was standard maritime jargon for a ship with watertight compartments. It was the newspapers looking for a sensational headline that dropped the practically. After the ship went down, the press leaned into the unsinkable narrative to make the story more ironic and tragic. The owners weren't necessarily more arrogant than any other shipbuilders of the era. They were just victims of a marketing term that the media turned into a curse. Number 7. Nero's absent violin. History remembers Emperor Nero as a psychopath who fiddled while Rome burned. He is the ultimate symbol of the detached, cruel ruler who watches his people suffer for his own entertainment. While Nero was certainly a troubled leader, this specific scene is a total impossibility. First, the violin wouldn't be invented for another 1400 years. If he played anything, it would have been a cythera, a type of lyre, but even that is unlikely. Historical records show that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the Great Fire of 64 AD started. He was at his villa in Antium, 30 miles away. When he heard the news, he rushed back to the city, opened his private gardens as a shelter for the homeless, and personally oversaw the relief efforts. The story of him playing music was political fake news spread by later Roman historians who hated him and wanted to ensure his legacy was one of madness. He was a bad emperor, but he wasn't a musical arsonist. Number 8. The 300 Spartans Group Project. Thanks to the movie 300, we imagine a tiny band of oiled-up Spartans standing alone against millions of Persians. It's the ultimate David versus Goliath story. But the Battle of Thermopylae was a team effort. While there were indeed 300 elite Spartans, they were supported by at least 7,000 other Greek soldiers from various city-states, including Thespians, Thebans, and Helphts. Even on the final day, when the 300 famously stayed behind to cover the retreat, they weren't alone. About 700 Thespians stayed and died with them.
We simplify the story to the 300 because it's easier to market a lone hero than a complex military alliance. The Spartans were the special forces, but they had a massive support staff that history and Hollywood conveniently forgot to put on the poster. Number 9. The short life statistic. You've heard the stat, the average person in the Middle Ages died at 30. This leads people to believe that 30 was old age and that everyone was dropping dead of natural causes in their late 20s. This is a complete misuse of statistics. The average life expectancy is heavily skewed by infant mortality. In the 1200s, many children didn't make it to their 5th birthday due to infection and poor nutrition. If you have 2 people and one dies at age 0 and the other dies at age 70, their average age of death is 35. That doesn't mean anyone actually died at 35. If a medieval person survived the dangerous years of childhood, they had a very good chance of living into their 60s, 70s, or even 80s. People weren't having midlife crises at 15. They lived long, full lives. They just didn't have antibiotics to help their infants survive the first year. Number 10. The Mozart brain myth. In the late 90s, the Mozart effect became a multi-million-dollar industry. Parents were convinced that playing classical music for their babies would wire their brains for genius, increasing their IQ and making them better at math. It was the ultimate lazy parenting hack. Just press play and create a prodigy. But the science was never there. The original 1993 study was performed on college students, not babies. It showed that listening to Mozart gave them a very slight boost in spatial reasoning that lasted for about 15 minutes. It didn't make them smarter, it just warmed up a specific part of their brain briefly. There is no evidence that music increases long-term intelligence in infants. Marketing companies simply took a tiny, short-term result and turned it into a scientific truth to sell CDs and toys to anxious parents. Music is great for kids, but it's not a software update for the brain. History is a game of telephone played over centuries, and as we've seen today, the version that survives isn't always the one that's true. It's just the one that's loudest. Whether it's an apple that never fell or an unsinkable ship that was never called that, we have to be willing to look past the movie trailer version of our past. The truth is usually more complicated, less dramatic, and requires a lot more reading than a Hollywood script, but it's the only way to actually understand where we came from. So the next time you hear a perfect historical fact, ask yourself, is this a library truth or just a really good marketing campaign? Thanks for watching, and keep questioning the story.